So after watching the prologue trailer for Jurassic World Dominion, I gotta say I was actually a little surprised to see the T-Rex looking like a baby elephant with all the hair-like feathers sprouting from all over its body. And while some of the decision making that went into the scene itself gave me body aches and chills, I was happy that they at least tried to show T-Rex in a way that is presumably up to date with current science. But is it though? Is this truly a step closer to reality than this? Did Tyrannosaurus Rex really have feathers, or not? Let's talk about that. Well, hello there, and welcome to Extinct on Impact. My name is A, and this little scamp on my shoulder is Ian.
Oh, there it is.
Now, before we get started, I want to give a big thank you to Dr. Dave Hone for helping to answer some of the questions that I had when researching this topic. Dr. Hone is a paleontologist and author of the Tyrannosaur Chronicles, which is without a doubt the best book I've ever read on T-Rex and its close relatives. So you can probably tell that I'm a big fan of T-Rex, and I can say with complete confidence that this animal draws about as much controversy as it does attention.
No!
And this topic in particular is especially divisive. I mean, it is absolutely ridiculous. And you may already be aware of this, but just in case you're not and you don't believe me, seriously, just go look around online for a little bit. I guarantee you it's not gonna take long to find some good stuff. For now, just know that I've done my best to zuck out any bias and to just keep this video as neutral as possible. But anyway, let's set up some context here. Why is this even a question? Why do we even consider that T-Rex may have had some kind of feathery integument? Well, the story that led to that question is pretty crazy. I mean, imagine this. You're at the 1965 New York World's Fair, staring up in amazement at that chunky tripod lizard rex. But before you can really take in the ample girth of its pot belly, a strange man wearing a trench coat slithers over to you and whips out a feathered T-Rex toy. He starts mumbling some nonsense about the future of paleontology before finally walking away and whispering back at you that you'll never see him again. But at this point, you begin to question his credibility because you do see him again. Several times, in fact. He just wasn't discreet. Now, you may not have believed him, but it wouldn't be long before at least some of his ideas sounded a little less insane. And that's because the late 1960s gave rise to a revolution in paleontology called the dinosaur renaissance. So up until that point, dinosaurs were viewed as cold-blooded, sluggish, and basically stupid, but two paleontologists named Robert Bacher and John Ostrom helped shape the way that we imagine and even study dinosaurs today. So while Bacher was arguing that dinosaurs were more active and had higher metabolic rates than we'd previously believed, Ostrom was busy taking this idea that birds are actual living dinosaurs and basically bringing it back from the Shadow Realm. Now, if we fast forward to the 90s, there was this explosion of feathered dinosaur discoveries, most of which were coming from a province of northeastern China called Liaoning. And it's from this region that we found an early ancestor of T-Rex called Delong paradoxus, which was officially named in 2004. Delong lived during the early Cretaceous, about 60 million years or so before T-Rex was even around. And let me tell you, this thing would have absolutely terrified the local lizard population. This was not a big animal. It was about as long as a yoga mat, and keep in mind that half of that is tail. We're talking about a little tyrannosaur that didn't weigh much more than 2 new Xbox consoles, which apparently I'm never going to own. But what made Delong so significant is that it was the first tyrannosaur we've ever found that showed direct evidence of simple feathers. And by the way, I'm using the term feather kind of broadly here. And that's because we're not talking about the bird feathers you sometimes find lying in the grass. Instead, Delong was covered in what are often called proto-feathers, which were the evolutionary precursors of the more complex feathers we're used to seeing. And they really were just simple branching filaments that looked a lot like the down feathers you see on baby birds. Now, I just want to quickly mention here that there is some argument that these proto-feathers aren't feathers at all, but instead just leftover collagen fibers. To be honest though, this is kind of a tinfoil hat theory. It's just not an idea that's gained too much traction. But going back to Delong, this tiny tyrannosauroid probably would have looked like it was covered in a furry coat. And functionally speaking, mammal fur isn't a terrible comparison, and that's because the main purpose of these fibers was to insulate and keep Delong nice and warm. Now at this time during the mid-2000s, feathers had only been associated with smaller theropods, and so it was thought that maybe the presence of feathers is ultimately limited by body size. Maybe larger theropods lacked feathers altogether in order to prevent overheating. heating. Well, that idea got socked right in the face because out from the same rocks as Dilong came Tyrannus huali, which actually lived at around the same time. Yeah, paleontology somehow managed to roll a perfect 20 with this one, because as far as feathered dinosaurs go, this thing was a freaking brute. I mean, geez, it was 40 times bigger than the second largest feathered dinosaur we've ever discovered. This one.
The Apiosaurus.
And hopefully I pronounced that right because its name is just random letters on a keyboard. Now, when it comes to Tyrannus, we're not talking T-Rex sized here or anything like that, but unless you were in some kind of exosuit robot thing, you definitely wouldn't be able to beat it up and take its lunch money. So to explain its size, the best I could come up with was the width of a tennis court when you're playing singles, and for mass, let's go with a Honda Civic. So this thing was getting on up there in size with more derived tyrannosaurs like Albertosaurus. And just like Dilong, Tyrannus was absolutely covered in these insulating proto-feathers. One big difference though is that some of Tyrannus's feathers were as much as 10 times longer than Dilong's. And we know that Tyrannus was completely drenched in these furry fibers, kinda like an oversized yak with StreamBeats legs. So at this point we not only had evidence of filamentous feathers among early members of the Tyrannosaur lineage, but we also knew that they weren't just limited to small-bodied forms. And so T-Rex must have been feathered too. Right?
Wrong!
Well, to try and answer that question, we need to pause our story for a bit because there is more to consider than just T-Rex's ancestry. Specifically, no discussion of feathers would be truly complete without first talking about the thermophysiological side of things. And what I mean by that is basically body heat retention. So the number one argument made against the potential for fluffy T-Rexes is just their massive size. Large animals exhibit something called gigantothermy, meaning because they're so big, they can maintain a relatively stable body temperature more easily than smaller bodied animals. And if you think about it, the idea of gigantothermy kind of makes sense intuitively. An elephant is going to lose body heat more slowly than something like a bearded dragon. To understand why this makes sense, we have to look at something called the square cube law. It's a principle that states that as a shape grows in size, its volume grows faster than the surrounding surface area. For example, because an elephant is a much bigger thing than a mouse, it has less skin surface in relation to its body volume than the mouse does. Hopefully that makes sense. And this has a significant effect on body heat retention, which means it also ties heavily into the issue of feathers. This means that Chungus-like proportions combined with a dense covering of filaments might have just led T-Rex to overheat and go the way of Old Yeller. And I know what you're thinking, what about Tyrannus? I mean, it was big and furry. And yeah, that fuzzball pushed the limits on what we thought was possible, but keep in mind that T-Rex was something like 6 times heavier. It was in a completely different league. Plus, there is some maximum body size where anything bigger means that gigantothermy's heat retention effect will start outweighing the benefits of insulation, and given how ultra feathered it was, clearly Tyrannus was well below this size limit. Now this size limit does depend on environmental temperature, and obviously the hotter the climate, the lower this size limit is going to be. For example, Albertosaurus was around the same size as Tyrannus, and if it had any feathers at all, it was definitely nowhere near as densely filamented. The difference here is that Tyrannus lived in a heavily forested region without much direct sunlight, so its super fluffy body covering was likely an adaptation to this shadier and colder environment. Okay, so if you go out and do any kind of research on this topic of T-Rex feathers for yourself, you're gonna see elephants being brought up a lot. And that's because they're often used as a modern day proxy for T-Rex, just because they're both pretty close in size. And now for the record, comparing herbivorous mammals to theropod dinosaurs is an atrociously horrible idea. But the fact that elephants are basically naked is seen as an example of how large-bodied tyrannosaurs might have also dealt with overheating. Now keep that in mind because here's where things get a little more complicated. So something important to note about gigantothermy is that the rounder the animal, the better that animal can retain body heat. And unless we're somehow ridiculously off base with modern reconstructions, T-Rex wasn't that round compared to something like an elephant. Its body shape is overall a lot more tapered, and because this means it would have had quite a bit more skin relative to its body volume, some people argue that feathers wouldn't have been such a big problem after all. And this is a good point, because it means T-Rex had a greater capacity to radiate off body heat for its size. But let's not forget that the Tyrant Lizard King was still a juggernaut of a theropod regardless regardless of its surface area to volume ratio, and so it's safe to assume that it would have had to have dealt with a decent amount of heat retention just due to its size alone. To put it simply, losing body heat becomes more difficult for big animals no matter what, and feathers would have made this more of a challenge. Now there is more to consider than just how big and round T-Rex was. For example, theropods had what's called an avian-style respiratory system, meaning they had a number of internal air sacs present throughout their bodies which would have helped to remove heat through evaporation. But keep in mind that birds also share this unique lung and air sac system, and yet they still struggle with heat loss. So we're not really too sure how helpful these pulmonary air sacs would have been for something as massive as T-Rex. And then there's the question of how much body heat would an adult T-Rex even produce? Well, according to paleontologist Andrea Cao, the answer is about the same as a 1-ton mammal. And because many mammals that approach or even exceed this size are still pretty hairy, he speculates that a T-Rex could have also retained a fibrous coat, especially considering its relatively large skin surface for shedding heat. One issue here is that he does assume a mass of 6 tons for a fully grown T-Rex, which is quite a bit lower than current estimates, and like we talked about earlier, a bigger, bulkier T-Rex that's say 8 or 9 tons is going to experience greater heat retention. That means that 1-ton mammal equivalent is probably too small of a comparison. Regardless, the take-home message still applies. Even though dinosaur metabolism is one of those things we're still not too sure about, the heat output of big theropods was probably less than mammals of similar size. So just taking metabolic rate into consideration, it's likely that a 6-ton T-Rex would have been able to manage a fuzzy exterior better than a 6-ton elephant. Theoretically anyway. Activity level is also an important factor to consider here, and that's because predatory behavior is going to demand more movement, leading to more body heat being generated. And for anyone that still subscribes to the idea that T-Rex just left hunting to the smaller theropods while it aimlessly waddled around looking for a leftover meat pile to disgracefully bury its face into, and yes, it definitely did do that when it had the opportunity.
We have a nasty looking scavenger.
I assure you that T-Rex was an active predator. You see, T-Rex and other derived tyrannosaurs not only have really long legs, but their feet also exhibit a special feature called, and prepare yourself here, the arctometatarsallian condition, where the middle metatarsal is literally wedged between its neighbors, creating a rigid, tight-knit foot structure. And both of these traits are linked to greater athletic ability. Now, you can probably see where I'm going with this: more activity, more body heat, less insulation. So when considering an active lifestyle, being entirely or at least mostly featherless would have been beneficial for getting rid of body heat. Now there is something that Dr. Hone brought up that I've personally never thought about.
I suspect something like T-Rex at adult was probably nocturnal or at least crepuscular, in which case overheating is probably far less of an issue, particularly if it's coming out in northern bit of the northern hemisphere where it's probably quite cold a lot of the time. I'm not saying it was, but if it was fundamentally nocturnal, it's not coming out in the day when it's hot. It's sitting under a tree in the shade where it's relatively cool.
So when we consider when an animal is active, all of this becomes even more complicated. And now I just want to mention one more thing, and this is an argument that I think is dying out nowadays because I'm not really seeing it being brought up too much. But there used to be some disagreement over the thermoregulatory role of feathers. Let me explain. So a study that is often cited here is one that compares emu feathers with kangaroo fur. And what this study finds is that, unlike the fur, the emu's feathers do a great job at absorbing solar radiation and preventing most of that thermal energy from reaching the skin's surface, thus allowing the birds to spend more time out in the sun without literally cooking alive. And some people have used the results of this study to argue that feathers wouldn't cause big theropods like T-Rex to overheat, and instead they may have actually helped to keep them cool. There's an issue with this though. While yes, they may be effective at keeping out heat from the sun, a covering of feathers is still going to trap body heat and prevent it from escaping into the atmosphere. It's still going to act as insulation. Even birds get tired of having all that fluff and have to cool off from time to time, and they have a ton of ways that they do this. Ostriches combat overheating by having legs devoid of feathers, and then of course you have your flying, bathing, and feather ruffling. Some birds will even drop a deuce on their legs to stay cool, so they get hot. Okay, so the point I want to drive home here is that this interplay between how much body heat is produced and how effectively it's retained has a huge impact on the presence of any kind of insulating structures, whether that be fur or feathers. And when you throw in the temperature of an animal's environment, things get even more complicated, especially when looking at an animal that's been dead for 66 million years. One thing is for sure though, if feathered or furry animals start dropping dead from getting too hot, then it's very likely that that fuzzy trait is going to be selected against and diminish over time until it's no longer a problem. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, all of this body heat stuff is great, but it sure would be nice if we had some direct evidence one way or another. Well, the good news is we're getting to that. So let's get back to our story, which I believe we left off at the discovery of Tyrannus. Oh, and if you're enjoying the video and you want to see more of Ian, because I mean, he's looking good, we would both greatly appreciate a quick like and subscribe. Oh yeah, and be sure to stick through to the end because I'm going to be doing a little giveaway thing to kind of kickstart the channel. Now, the possibility of T-Rex and other large derived tyrannosaurs having simple feathers was an idea that had been floating around even before D-Long was discovered, but it wasn't until Tyrannus came around in 2012 that things really took off. More and more fuzzy T-Rex illustrations started popping up, and even video games like Saurian were putting their tyrant lizard through a feathered fondue machine. And this image of everyone's favorite dinosaur being covered in feathers was even starting to sink in among the general public, and everyone was sorta kinda getting used to it, even if it was more difficult for some. And then just half a decade later, in 2017, this happened. The Belladol paper. Yeah, so this study by Phil Bell and colleagues definitely kicked up some dirt and made the whole T-Rex feather debate a bit murkier. So what I'm gonna do is give you the overall Spark Notes rundown of the study, and then I'll go into some of the opinions and issues surrounding it because there's controversy. Anyway, if you're already familiar with this study, then you know that we not only have fossilized skin impressions from T-Rex, but also from Albertosaurus, Gorgosaurus, Daspletosaurus, and Tarbosaurus. Am I missing any? No. And these are all close relatives. They all belong to a group of large late Cretaceous tyrannosaurs called the Tyrannosaurids. Now let's just take a moment to appreciate how rare it is to find skin impressions from any dinosaur, much less from the Tyrannosaurids. It's not like we're just tripping over them out in the field or anything. So the fact that we have evidence of soft tissue from all of these species is, I mean, it's cool or whatever. And these skin impressions are the topic of discussion here, with the main focus being those belonging to a T-Rex specimen called Wyrex from the Houston Museum of Natural Science. And these little 3D skin imprints are sprinkled over a few major areas of the body surface. We're talking the base of the tail, around the top of the hips, and somewhere on the neck. And if we want to throw in scale impressions from the other Tyrannosaurids, then we can even add part of the belly and torso to this list, as well as the middle part of the tail. So this gives us a pretty decent sample of the body as a whole. By no means is it a perfect representation of T-Rex's entire external appearance, but it's not bad either. And what makes these skin patches such a big deal is that they're covered in these well-defined, pebbly-looking bumps with no signs of feathers anywhere in sight. And so the study concludes that T-Rex and its close relatives must have lost their ancestral covering of feathers over 100 million years ago and were left entirely scaly. I will say that the authors were clear that this isn't some open and shut case, and that Tyrannosaurid integument is still ultimately a mystery. They even point out that feathers could have existed on the top of the body, which is an area that isn't represented by the skin impressions, so they were being careful not to just bring the hammer down. But anyway, with this news, you can imagine that the press reacted with nothing but neutral and unbiased reporting, a real credit to the transmission of accurate information by Homo sapiens, right? No, they descended on this story like grackles to a grocery store parking lot. To me, it seems like these news outlets felt as though they finally won some hard-fought battle against those pesky scientific dweebs, as though they somehow vindicated T-Rex and are celebrating its true and final form. And this is the problem that I mentioned at the very start of this video. It's people who are really dead set on a certain look just because they like it. It's as if they go all in on this cool factor hypothesis and ignore the science entirely. unless of course it falls in line with their preference. I see a lot of stuff like, oh, feathered T-Rexes ruined my childhood, or feathers make T-Rex look like a big wuss. And you know, I think most of this comes from the fact that because T-Rex is so iconic and so well known, most people already have an image in their minds of what the animal must have looked like. And there's just a lot of resistance to anything that challenges this. But that's not good, especially when we're talking about paleontology, which really doesn't sit still for too long. It's constantly evolving. At the end of the day, we need to remember that T-Rex was a living thing. I mean, it breathed, it ate, it mated, it crapped in the forest, it slept, and it just seems wrong that these tiny little rat-like creatures that weren't even on T-Rex's radar, by the way, would one day evolve the cognitive ability to say, hey, feathers make T-Rex look like a big, silly goose. So does this mean the debate is over? T-Rex is scaly again and we can finally hang up screenshots from Jurassic Park in museums all around the world? It's not that simple. The thing is, there were already rumors and whispers in the wind that these skin impressions existed, and when they finally came to light after the study was published, plenty of people still weren't convinced or even fazed. First of all, despite these patches covering a few distinct areas of the body's surface, certain regions are still a mystery, like near the shoulders, for example. Not to mention, most of these fragments are only a few centimeters wide, and we're talking about a 40+ foot animal here, so there's just a lot of surface area unaccounted for. Oh, and when I say these skin patches are small, I'm really not exaggerating. This is about the same size as the largest T-Rex skin patch examined in the study, and most of them were much smaller even than this. To explain why this matters, we need to talk about one of the study's biggest problems, and that's that their analysis treats scales and feathers as an either-or scenario, as if the animal couldn't have both kinds of integument. The thing is, scales and feathers are not mutually exclusive. Both can be present at the same time on the same animal. The absence of feathers in one region of the body doesn't mean they didn't exist somewhere else, so extrapolating T-Rex's entire body covering from just these tiny skin patches alone might be a tad bit overzealous. Now, having said that, paleontologist Mark Whitten does a good job of reminding us that we shouldn't just devalue them because of their small size. He writes, the fact that each patch is consistent with regard to scale size and texture hints at them being part of a continuous unbroken integument and not isolated scaly pockets in a sea of fluff. So the overall similarities among these skin impressions might indicate that this is just how T-Rex looked over most of its body. And speaking of size, these little pebbly bumps that we see on the T-Rex skin imprints are incredibly tiny. We're talking less than 1 millimeter in diameter. So unless you pressed your nose up against T-Rex's leg and just took in that intoxicatingly nasty rank, you wouldn't be able to even see them. The texture is so fine-grained that there's even some speculation that we're looking at textured skin rather than true epidermal scales, something like the skin of a chicken's waddle. But what kind of throws a wrench into this idea is the fact that the abdominal skin impressions from the Albertosaurus specimen actually show feature scales. Think of the round spiky projections on an iguana's neck that stand out and are surrounded by smaller scales. This just isn't something you're going to find on plain old skin, and if you do, well, that ain't good. Of course, we're talking about two different species here, and unfortunately we don't have skin impressions from T-Rex's belly to see if it had feature scales. So as of right now, we can't rule out the idea that this is just naked skin. And this is actually something that Dr. Hone stressed during our conversation.
All the discussion you see going around about this paper and T-Rex, and the word is scales. And scales are a thing, as you sort of hinted there, as in that they are a specific form of epidermal structure. And if you look at animals with a non-technical biologist hat on, call scales, they are not the same thing. The scales you get on the feet of birds are not scales, they're very highly modified feathers. The skin that you get on the heads of crocodiles is not scales, it is, as you say, a sheet of skin which basically cracks and breaks to form irregular polygons that look superficially a lot like scales.
Right.
But they're not scales in the way that an iguana has scales. There was this lovely paper that came out a couple of years after the Bell one, basically looking at elephant skin. And it's very, very thick keratinous skin. And it basically grows into this thick sheet and then cracks and breaks. And there are these like microscopic level close-ups of them. And they look just like the scales described for Tyrannosaurs.
Whoa.
I'm not suggesting that Tyrannosaurs or other theropods or even other dinosaurs necessarily have this, but it's another thing you can have things which look extraordinarily like scales that are not scales. I think it's reasonable to say we cannot tell those things apart from the fossil record, and therefore, is T-Rex scaly? It might look scaly, but the heads of elephants look scaly, and they're not, and the heads of crocodiles look scaly, and they're not, and the feet of birds look scaly, and they're not. But the structures on T-Rex and other Tyrannosaur skin that have been described are not necessarily scale.
As a quick side note, we're at least fairly confident that T-Rex's face was pretty scaly, and that's because epidermal scales can physically change the underlying bone, leaving behind a kind of rough texture, which we do see in T-Rex skulls. But going back to the whole skin idea, another similar possibility is that this is just naked skin that has lost its plumage, like a plucked chicken. And let's stay here for a second, because this post-mortem defeathering idea kind of segues into another big issue with the study.
Here's a step-by-step guide to becoming a fossil. Step 1, die.
So how an animal dies, decomposes, falls apart, and is buried, and where and how it fossilizes all have a huge impact on tissue preservation. This is what's called taphonomy. It's the study of anything and everything about fossilization, and guess what? The study doesn't talk about it. And the reason why this is such a big deal is, well, if you thought scales were hard to come by in the fossil record, feathers are even more stubborn. Whether they just rot away or fall off after some big rainstorm or something, we can't rule out the possibility that they just didn't fossilize. Plus, unlike the Ischian Formation where Eutyrannus and Delong were discovered, the type of rocks where the Tyrannosaur skin impressions were found are notoriously bad at preserving dino fuzz. Or as Dr. Hone puts it,
we basically got one skeleton with some feathers on it in 100 odd years of digging in one of the most productive sites on Earth. Feathers just don't preserve in those rocks. I think if there was a lot of feathered animals knocking around there, we'd have found them by now, and they're not. It's just not preserving. You know, tens of Tyrannosaurs from those beds, and Alvarezsaurs, and Ornithomimosaurs, and Oviraptorosaurs, and birds, and a whole bunch of other things which absolutely have feathers, and we're just not finding feathers.
Now, paleontologist André Acau is particularly big on exploring taphonomic factors. In one of his articles, he writes about having observed a dehydrated penguin carcass that had completely lost its feathers during decomposition, and he suggests that this might give us insight into what may have happened to the T-Rex skin impressions. In other words, what we're seeing may just be a case of something called preservation bias. Now, at the same time, it's a little weird that we're not finding at least some clue that feathers were present. And no, this doesn't mean they weren't there. The filaments might have just been so thin that they didn't leave behind any visible impressions. But it's important to keep in mind that if T-Rex did have some amount of filamentous feathers, these tissue imprints aren't giving anything away. Taphonomy is so important that it's even been argued that these impressions might not be biological in origin at all, but rather some weird structures that formed after the animal died. But here's the thing, if these tissue imprints really are the byproduct of some wacky taphonomic process, then we'd probably expect to see some differences between each impression. And like I mentioned earlier, they're all pretty similar. At the end of the day, most people seem to agree that what we're looking at are in fact imprints of actual tissue. In fact, the authors of the Belladol paper actually bring up an interesting theory on what kind of integumentary tissue we might be looking at here, and it has to do with the disappearance of the feathers themselves. So for context, the scales you see on the feet of birds are not the same as the scales that make bearded dragons like Ian just so pretty. They're not homologous structures in the same way that fish scales aren't the same as snake scales. Now, quick note here, the term scale really is a catch-all term that can refer to a lot of very different and unrelated things. It's confusing. Anyway, it's thought that birds pulled the old switcheroo from feathers to scales by stunting feather development early on, resulting in what I like to call imposter scales. And the authors suggest that tyrannosaurs might have undergone a similar transition from feathers to these epidermal structures masquerading as scales. I mean, just look at how similar the reticula of an emu's foot compared to the scale-like bumps from the Wyrex specimen. Of course, this is all just speculation because we obviously don't know what kind of developmental processes go into making T-Rex skin. But according to Dr. Hone, the idea that Tyrannosaurs were covered in these feather scales seems unlikely, given how derived this trait really is. But if somewhere along the Tyrannosaur family tree, their integumentary system really did get a little creative with gene regulation and essentially disguise what were once feathers as scales, then that means that T-Rex skin is a lot more complex than we initially thought. At the very least, it would make the overly simplistic war between feathers and scales all the more redonkulous. Okay, so now we need some kind of conclusion here, even if we have to rig it together with duct tape and cardboard. Well, first of all, based on the skin impressions we have, we can say with reasonable certainty that T-Rex was less feathered than we were starting to believe just a few years ago. So as much as I absolutely adore the Captain Caveman look of some of the shaggier T-Rex illustrations, we're probably gonna have to go ahead and retire those right next to the good old tail draggers from back in the day. Bruh. So did the Tyrant Lizard King have any feathers at all? Oh man, you are going to love this answer. We don't know. If we look at T-Rex's phylogeny, its family history, then we would predict that Tyrannosaurids should have retained at least some amount of simple feathers. In fact, the entire Tyrannosaur lineage is surrounded by groups filled to the brim with feathered species. But if we were to put blinders on and only go off of the fossilized skin impressions, then this direct evidence suggests that T-Rex really was as naked as ever. So there are a few possibilities here. First of all, we can't rule out the idea that T-Rex had regionalized plumage over areas of its body that aren't represented by the impressions, and unfortunately that does mean that this mangy looking Chupacabra Rex isn't off the table. I will say though that this idea doesn't sit right with me personally. Kinda feels like we're just filling in the gaps here to just get those feathers in there. Another possibility is that it had some light fuzz scattered all over, with little hair-like filaments sprouting from skin or between scales like weeds on an old sidewalk. And this idea in particular is what Dr. Hone sides with the most.
You know, you've got owl feet, which again, bird foot scales are not really scales, they're very highly modified feathers, but you see the feathers poking out from between these scales. So if, and it's a massive if on this scale, but if those T-Rex inverted commas scales are extremely heavily modified feathers, then there's absolutely no reason at all to think that they don't have feathers in addition to those. It's probably not covered in any kind of dense plumage. Otherwise, it probably wouldn't have skin looking like that, but it's still not impossible. My personal best guess is that this is actually very rough skin of some description, and I personally very strongly suspect there was feather filaments between them that are just not showing up.
And if this was the case, then that means the T-Rex from the Jurassic World Dominion prologue scene really is a step in the right direction. And I say that very loosely. Now, another fairly popular theory is that maybe T-Rex was feathered throughout its adolescence and just gradually lost this baby fuzz as it grew into adulthood. I want to clarify that we have a zero evidence for this, but if these scaly looking bumps that we're seeing from the Y-Rex specimen really are scales derived from feathers, then who knows what kind of black magic T-Rex skin was capable of. Certainly a dino fuzz covered baby growing into a featherless adult wouldn't be too outlandish. And finally, maybe the fossilized skin impressions really are showing us the real deal. Maybe scaliness or just naked skin really was the main epidermal trait of the eternally peace-signing Tyrants. Blue Rhino Studios actually crafted an awesome statue of Sue that is, in my opinion, the most realistic example of how a fully scaled T-Rex would have looked. It's not only thick, but it has really pretty eyes too that don't give off that crackhead vibe. Keep in mind that when it comes to feathers, absence of proof is not proof of absence, but let's not take it too far in the other direction and start assuming T-Rex was fuzzy just because it's possible. The point is, we need to be cautious here. A lot of people have basically superglued themselves to a certain side, and I just want to warn you that paleontology has a way of setting us straight when we get too attached to a certain idea. And Dr. Hone perfectly echoes my thoughts on this while also emphasizing just how up in the air this whole debate really is.
We've got a bunch of patches of skin which may or may not show scales, which may or may not be capable of preserving feathers, which may or may not have been there. The answer to that is not T-Rex is scaly, which is what everyone seems to take it as being. I think the evidence is pretty ambivalent, and certainly it's an awful lot more ambivalent than I think the vast majority of people discussing it online think it is.
And maybe generalizing isn't such a good idea anyway. Maybe body covering varied dramatically between different Tyrannosaurus species. Plus, T-Rex did inhabit a pretty big area, so if they did have feathers, maybe northern populations had greater filament density to deal with colder temperatures. Maybe this density changed depending on the season. I mean, who knows?
You can't look at one dot and say, this is where T-Rex lived. I would be utterly amazed if it didn't occupy the vast majority of North America. Again, it's the same thing as, leopards are a great example. Well, we've got leopards in the Himalayas and we've got leopards in the Sahara, but they're fundamentally different locally adapted populations. Looking at T-Rexes from a relatively small strip of North America is not necessarily going to tell you what the whole population is.
Anyway, this is just food for thought, and we obviously can't answer these questions just yet. So to close things off, we're just gonna have to wait until the fossil record blesses us with more fossil evidence, maybe even a T-Rex with preserved soft tissue, if you're good. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed the video, and I just wanna let you know that I'll be randomly selecting 3 people from my first 500 subscribers and giving them a free t-shirt from my website. Now I will say though that it's still fairly new, so I don't have too many designs out yet, but if I do choose you, I'll let you pick out your favorite tee and I'll send it your way free of charge. Also, I'm certainly not infallible, so if I made a mistake or if I said something you don't agree with or you just want to add to the conversation, I would be super interested to hear what your thoughts and opinions are on this debate down in the comments below.
I'm doing my part.